Hi everyone, welcome back to our video updates. Today's video is going to discuss adverse possession, and I'm going to try to summarize this for educational purposes because it's more nuanced or detailed in practice, but this is just to give you an overview of what it looks like, what it's about, and how it typically works. And when I'm talking about the adverse possession in this video, I'm talking about according to Texas laws, because that is where I practice, and each state would have slightly different laws when it comes to adverse possession, and some states may not even have provisions for it at all. I'm pretty sure you've heard the term adverse possession before, and people typically use it to talk about how somebody can get title to property that's not theirs. People typically talk about ways in which you can get property that's really not yours. That's typically in the context in which you hear people talking about adverse possession. So let me try to summarize the way that the law is set up here in Texas and kind of give you a little bit of contextual background. So adverse possession is when somebody has actual and visible possession of real property, and they've started to possess it and continue to possess it visibly for a period of time. And after that certain period of time is passed, the other parties or potential parties that might believe that they are the rightful owners of that property, they have a certain number of years to come forward to put in their claims. If they don't put forward their claims within a certain amount of years, they lose the right to be able to come back to claim the property. So that's the whole premise of the adverse possession laws. It's actually a law that's in the negative against the party that might believe that they have superior right to that property. In Texas, the premise of the adverse possession is the period of time that a person has to be able to come forward and claim property that they believe is rightfully theirs. So the adverse possession period is a certain amount of time that the person has to come forward, or they lose the right to try to get their property back from somebody that's adversely possessing it. And adverse possession, if you listen to the words adverse, it essentially just means something that's against or in opposition to. When we're looking at the laws here in Texas, it says that the adverse possessor had to have had actual visible possession of that property for that extended period of time. Now, sometimes it's okay if the first adverse possessor passes over the property to a relative, so that means that they have privity of estate, and so the first person dies and maybe their child takes over the property, so the adverse possession period will continue throughout that family, even though the initial adverse possessor had passed away. The periods of time vary in Texas depending on the facts of each case. So, generally speaking, there's a 3-year period, there's a 5-year period, a 10-year period, a 15-year period, and a 25-year period. The 25-year period is the best in the sense that it doesn't require a lot of proof to be able to possess that property, because after 25 years, the other party had every chance to come forward and didn't. So the adverse possession would be easier to prove if the person that's been in adverse possession of the property has had it for 25 years, has been using it continuously within that family for 25 years and paying taxes on it and things like that. The 3-year limitation period is the shortest one, and that means if the party that feels like he or she truly owns the property doesn't come forward within 3 years, then they are not able to come forward to claim that property. The 3-year limitation period applies when the adverse possessor has some color of title under which they're claiming that they own that property. So maybe they believe that they purchased it from a rightful owner, and then another party shows up saying, well, I'm the rightful owner, right? But if it's already been more than 3 years, then the adverse possessor has a chance to be able to file a lawsuit to declare that they own that property as opposed to the other party. But it really depends on what kind of chain of title they can prove, because the 3-year limitation is dependent on the ownership of the property under a color of title, they call it, so almost like an appearance of title. And then the 5-year limitation period is a little bit similar, but the difference is that that party had been using the property, the adverse possessor. Of course, it's always going to be actual visible use of the property and for a continuous period of time. So it's going to be for a 5-year period of time that they've been doing that. And the party has been paying taxes on the property as well. And they also have some sort of title instrument that they're relying on. Perhaps they also purchased it from somebody that claimed that that person was the owner of the property. So they relied on that, moved on to the property and started cultivating it and using it and paying the taxes on there. And now it's been more than 5 years and somebody else might have shown up saying that that person is the true owner of the property. So the adverse possessor would then file a lawsuit and try to get clear title from the court as between the adverse possessor and the new party that's shown up. The adverse possessor could also initiate that lawsuit without anybody showing up, just to be able to get clear title for future purposes. Then the next limitation period is 10 years. It's similar to the 5-year period. The main difference is there is no requirement of having a title instrument. But if you have a title instrument, that's okay, but there's no requirement of having a title instrument, and there's no requirement of having paid the taxes for those continuous years either. So it'll be 10 years of using the property, cultivating the property. Maybe you're using it for agricultural purposes, maybe living on it, maybe renting it out, and otherwise keeping it up. And then it's already been 10 years, then you could file a lawsuit to try to get clear title to that property. And if you have some instrument that you believe entitles you to ownership of the property, then that helps as well, but it's not required under the 10-year limitation period. Then the next limitation period is the 15-year period, and that one it has a lot of requirements because it's for co-heirs, and the co-heirs are people that inherited property together, not by will, not through a will, but through the intestacy laws. So the laws that apply when somebody died without a will would sometimes cause siblings to co-own property, or it would cause the children to co-own the property with the spouse of the deceased. So when you're co-heirs and the other party doesn't ever show up, and you're the only one paying the taxes for those number of years, the 15-year period, you can then go to through a process to get adverse possession of that property, to finally get clear title in your name only. So that's what the 15-year limitation period is for. The 15-year limitation period has a lot of requirements that you have to satisfy before being able to get that title in your name. And that particular one does not necessarily require a court case, but it's always safest to go through court to get an order, because the title companies love to see the clear title with no cloud on it whenever you're trying to sell it in the future. It's nice to have a court order. The next limitation period is that 25-year one. It's a blanket one that covers every scenario possible, and they also have some sort of title instrument that they're relying on. Perhaps they also purchased it from somebody that claimed that that person was the owner of the property. Of course, most times when people are in possession of property and using it, they're under the impression that they have some entitlement to it, and that's the only reason they've been paying the taxes. So the 25-year period requires that you had been paying the taxes before the taxes became delinquent for all of those years, and that you had been using the property and enjoying the property and uninterrupted for that period of time. Now again, it doesn't have to be specifically one person. It could have been that one person started the possession, the adverse possession, and passed the property down to a relative or family member. As long as there's privity of estate, you can continue the period for 25 years, and then finally the youngest person that gets to inherit it through adverse possession can then file a claim to be able to clear the title into that person's name. So that's how adverse possession generally works. The possession again has to be actual possession, physical possession of the property. It has to be visible to everyone. So it cannot be just something you secretly are plotting in your mind. It has to be clear to everybody that walks onto that property that you are the one using it. And then it has to be inconsistent with the claim of any other parties, and it has to be hostile to another person's claim. So that just means that it's just adverse. It's against any other person's claim, meaning that you're taking over the whole thing and you're using it as if it's yours. And that would satisfy that requirement. It cannot be a friendly arrangement. It cannot be that the owner had originally agreed to let you just use it sometimes. Typically, it has to be a hostile use that was never permitted. But sometimes you might be able to prove that it was hostile because the permission was revoked and you continue to use it and the owner never came back to claim it. The other thing that's super important to know is that the limitations period that I mentioned, whether it's the 3-year, the 5-year, the 10-year, 15-year, or the 25-year period, it does toll or pause anytime that you have somebody that has a disability on the other side. So a disability, the way it's defined here in Texas, says that if somebody is of unsound mind, and sometimes the disability is temporary and sometimes it's permanent. So with unsound mind, let's say somebody had an accident and they were out of it for about a year, or maybe had a stroke, and they were just of unsound mind for that short period of time, then the disability was only for 1 year. The other way that you have a disability, if somebody was in the armed forces and there was a war going on and they were deployed to go fight in the war, so that would cause a temporary disability. And so it's not a disability in the physical sense or any other sense that we're used to. It's a disability legally. That's causing them not to be able to assert their rights. And then the third way that somebody can have a disability is if the person is a minor. Even if the minor is married or in the, doing other things, working and stuff, they're still a minor legally if they're not yet 18 years old. So that disability would also be a temporary one, because once the person turns 18, then this disability is removed. So how does that affect all of this adverse possession stuff that we're talking about? If someone is a minor, for instance, that inherited property and the executor of the estate didn't handle things well and sort of started taking over things or selling the property off, and the minor was only, let's say, 10 years old at the time, then the 10-year-old child is not going to be able to assert his or her rights because they're depending on adults, because children depend on adults to be able to assert their rights for them. So in that case, that child's age matters. So let's say that the adverse possessor, the person that purchased the property from the executor, thinking that the executor had a right, that person has been using the property for a few years. And so the person will be able to do adverse possession either under the 5-year period or the 10-year period. So let's say it's the 5-year period and that child is only 10. Well, the 5-year period is going to pass. It's going to be done by the time the child is 15 years old. but a 15-year-old child cannot bring a lawsuit to try to claim the property back. So the disability is going to stop the clock until that child is actually 18 before you can resume the clock. So the clock would not start in this case for 8 years because that child was only 10 years old. So from 18, you'll then count the 5-year limitation period or the 10-year limitation period, whichever applies. And then the adverse possession can actually kick in because that child can bring a lawsuit within the 5-year period to try to get the property back. And if he or she doesn't, then maybe possibly the adverse possessor can get the property that way. If it's a 10-year limitation that applies, then the child would have until 28 to be able to bring a lawsuit, and then the adverse possessor has to wait until the child is older than 28. Then the adverse possessor can go to court and try to get title to that property. So that's how the disability would affect things. In the 25-year limitation period, it's a blanket umbrella limitation period, and by 25 years, they expect somebody to show up, whether the person was a minor before, whether the person was of unsound mind. They expect their family members to show up to try to claim the property. So the law says that after 25 years, it doesn't matter whether the other party had a disability at the time or not. As long as 25 years have passed and the adverse possessor has been in possession for that long, been paying taxes for that long, then they do have a right to be able to claim adverse possession. So that's how the law works, and it's all very complex in reality, but it can be done, and people have successfully used it. It's not used that often because there are other tools that could be used under the law most times, but occasionally you come across cases where it has to be done because one person has been shouldering the burden of taking care of the property for years and years and years, or one particular family has been doing it, and so they do have a right to be able to claim adverse possession, and the time period has already passed, so why not? So that's my quick overview for you for today. If you have specific questions, of course, you always have to consult with a lawyer to make sure that you're getting the information needed for your situation. And thank you for watching the video as always, and I'll talk to you next time.